Thanks. There is one end of the spectrum that we haven't yet explored. Actually, it's one thing that has remained the same for every single TED Talk that I know of, and that is you have had no influence over what happens on this stage. So I thought that this year for Full Spectrum we should change that, and that is why you all have those red and green cards, because at various points during this talk I will offer you a decision of what is going to happen next in this talk, and I want you to use your cards to vote on that and to determine which path this talk will take and which parts of this talk no one will ever get to see. So whenever you're up for making a decision, it's going to look like this. So first, for practice, are you already here? I do see a lot of green, which is great. Of course, it also means that you will never know what would have happened if you had said no. So one more thing. Apparently, TED figured that if you get 2 choices all the time, I only get half the time. So you will really have to be lightning fast with your votes here, no matter what happens. So for example, if I ask you to accept the license agreement of this talk, you will immediately... Thank you, green, that's good. Of course, you wouldn't have had a real choice here anyway, because it's a license agreement, and you never really have any real choice with license agreements. But now, the concept of adding choice to something, to a story, something that is essentially linear, many of you might be reminded of these books here. This is a choose your own adventure book, which I guess many of you still know from their childhood. And yes, and at various points, they offered you a decision of what you would do next. And depending on what you would do next, the story would continue in very different ways. And actually, the invention of those books is quite interesting because, well, first of all, it took a few hundred years until somebody actually came up with the idea, which I find rather strange. And then secondly, when this man here, Edward Packard, invented those books, it was more or less by accident. And I would like to tell you that story. I just need some guidance on the perspective here. So, oh, that's a bit more green, I think. So, in the late 1960s, Caroline and Andrea Packard, they were living in New York, and each night when their father would come home, he would make up bedtime stories for them. And all of those bedtime stories, they had a common theme. They were about a guy named Pete, and he was living on this vast, dangerous island in the middle of the ocean. And each night he would have a different adventure on that island, until one fateful night where, well, actually Pete had kind of run out of things to do on that island. So he didn't really know what to do. And that night was when Caroline and Andrea were asked a question that I think they had secretly been waiting for a long time, because their father simply asked them, so what do you think Pete is going to do now? And they were very enthusiastic about it, but also they were in complete disagreement. So much in disagreement that, in fact, they forced their father this night to tell them 2 different bedtime stories with very different endings. And that is how those books were actually born. And they became very, very successful. But what I find surprising is just how successful they became. So, are we going to go with the facts here, I think? Okay, nobody. Okay, so emotion. It's green. I heard complaints. Some parts no one will ever get to see. So, so all kids love those books. And Edward Packard got a bunch of letters, and I think this letter is very telling, from a little girl in Vermont who wrote to Edward Packard saying, "I got lots of spears in my back. I went down a quicksand, and that was so great." So. Kids just love dying in those books for some apparent reason. And it also allowed Edward Packard to follow his true passion, because actually he figured he didn't really like law that very much, and it allowed him to become a full-time writer, which he still is today. But in spite of all of this success, the format of Choose Your Own Adventure never really caught on beyond children's and teenage adventure books. There's one book in French literature, and actually it has some very odd adult entertainment novels, but other than that, never caught on, and it never caught on to TED, which I find strange, because it's an ingenious combination of entertainment and design. Plus, if you take this concept to a TED Talk, you also have technology in the mix, which is great, because basically anything can be finely tuned to your taste, right down to the color of the slides. So what's it going to be? We have a lot of Jade fans in here, which is an interesting path in this talk, because actually we could take this even further and kind of introduce the concept of a TED pre-talk, where we just ask you what kind of talks you like to hear. So, for example, do you prefer your TED Talks to be rather the quiet ones, or do you like the expressive ones? Which ones? Oh. Expressive, great. Do you want them to be idealistic or detailed? Oh, that's a tough one. Idealistic. And do you like your TED Talks to be more personal or analytical? Personal. So with those three questions, we now have your personality profile here, basically, so in a basic Myers-Briggs kind of way. So we're all looking forward to TED 2013, the undiscovered hype generators. Now, of course, we also have every one of you here on HD video, so we're going to figure out your individual personality profiles as well later on. It's all covered by the license agreement, so you don't really have to worry about that. Now, of course, there is a real danger here, or threat, and that is if you offer too much choice, you end up with replacing serendipity with fulfilled expectations. And I think it might even beg the question if there can be such a thing as choose your own TED Talk, because it may be just that choice and TED Talk, or you're not coming here because of choice, are not the wrong kind of choice. And interestingly, that is also something that the Choose Your Own Adventure books figured out as time went by. And I would like to visualize this for you in your preferred way. Which would be the trees. I deliberately did not call it bubbles, because then, because of Hans Rosling, everybody would have gone with A. But so what you see here is the decision tree of one of the very first Choose Your Own Adventure books. And you can see it's a very rich offering of different storylines, and you can end up at over 40 different endings. And this is how the books looked 7 years later on. And you can see it's greatly simplified. So there is actually not many diversions from the main story. And one thing that you have to look hard to spot out in this picture, there's actually only one very good ending to the story. So choice, it turns out, in stories or books is not about offering very many different stories, but it's about playing with a story and enriching that. It even went so far, this is one of my favorite ideas of that, playing with the oops, you don't get to see that one yet, of playing with that ideas, and that is in this one book, where the story is you're captured by aliens, and they want you to look with them for a planet of paradise. And you're told in the beginning of the book that you cannot reach that planet by making decisions or following directions. And that is actually what it turns out to be. There's a chapter right in this book where you do reach the best possible ending in this book, but you cannot reach it from any other chapter. So Edward Packard wanted you to deliberately step out of those mechanics that he imposed on you and just make your own choices, which I think is also a wonderful lesson, because it shows that with a new format, you can play with the rules, and you can play even with the most fundamental and the most sacred rules, which of course is also why you don't get to make that choice. Palm Springs has already chosen that we're going to explore the full spectrum of PowerPoint presentations here, which is option B, and with a slide that I think will forever stick in your mind, try to convince you that interactive TED Talks could actually be very fun, because it's Choose Your Own Adventure plus technology. But of course, this talk, it can only be an invitation to that. So I think there's a lot to explore, actually, with Choose Your Own TED Talk. Think about voting on stage modifications, voting on speaker emotions, or simply just turning a talk into a game for the audience to play. But whether you accept that invitation, that is your choice right now. Are we going to have more? Very mixed vote. Well, of course, I'm going to go with green here. So so that the end of my talk is actually where we can see the story beginning. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. You know, to pull that off must have been a technical tour de force. I mean, how do you go from a PowerPoint down to individual slides, tree fork like that.
Okay, so it's a special PowerPoint that allows you to branch into different directions. So just as with the books, it's not linear anymore. So now you can use PowerPoints and jump to whichever parts you want
I had
at the
no
press
idea
of a key.
PowerPoint could do that. I would
It can't if you don't program it. So
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Sebastian.